Hey everyone, this is Pastor Alan Hathaway from the Garrison Church of God. I'm glad you joined us today. This is the beginning of a new series. It's called Day by Day. It's looking at Romans, some thoughts from Romans chapter 14, verses 5 through 6. For the early Christians, there was quite a unique experience. We think about the concept of a weekend, but in truth, for the early Christians, that kind of a concept didn't even exist. If they were Jewish, they had the concept of the Sabbath, and the Sabbath began on Friday evening at sundown and ended on Saturday evening at sundown. The Jewish people had practiced the Sabbath for a very long time, and the Romans had allowed the Jewish people to celebrate the Sabbath as part of their weekly observance. But that was not extended to the rest of the Roman world. And so the 7-day work week was a reality for Romans in their world, except on special holidays declared by the government. So when we talk about this concept of a weekend, that really didn't even exist in Western thinking until after Christianity had conquered the Roman world. Christians had traditionally used Sunday as their day of worship, but it was not a day of rest for Christians. Most of the time, if they wished to attend services, they had to get up way early in the morning before the workday began and meet with Christians for an early service prior to the workday beginning, or they had to meet at the close of the workday in the evening. So they either met very early in the morning or very early in the evening on Sundays. Now, the reason they chose Sunday was because of the resurrection. It was a celebration of the resurrection each and every Sunday. So whenever they met together, it was in celebration of the resurrection, but it was a regular work day. They had to work on that day, and so it wasn't like our present weekend where we tend to treat Sunday as another Sabbath day. But for the early Christians, that was not so. For us as Christians, we can appreciate the wonder and the joy of that. The Apostle Paul, however, talked about the struggle that Christians have with this concept of special days, because in their world, the Jewish Christians were very much trying to force upon the Gentile Christians the concept of the Sabbath and the keeping of the Sabbath. And this is what Paul had to say to the Romans in chapter 14, beginning in verse 5 on this particular subject. One person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day, observe it to the Lord. And he who does not observe the day, to the Lord he does not observe it. He who eats, eats to the Lord, for he gives God thanks. And he who does not eat to the Lord, he does not eat and gives God thanks. So the concept for us as Christians is that there is a wide variance in what we observe as part of our worship experience and our experience as Christians. That's why not all churches follow the same rituals. Not all churches celebrate the same holidays. Not all churches view worship times the same. And that's fine. That's the way it should be for us as Christians. We have a great deal of latitude in what things we think are important. However, the days of our lives are important, and the Apostle Paul makes it clear to us that every day really belongs to the Lord and should be a day of worship. Whether it is a Sunday or a Monday, it should be considered for a Christian a day of worship. This month, I want to talk a little bit about various days that come up during the month. This particular Sunday happens to be National Submarine Day. And I thought that would be an interesting one to kind of pick apart for a thought for this particular Sunday. I'll be sharing with you from Colossians chapter 2, beginning with verse 8. And I'll be talking to you about underwater, unlettered, unerased. And I'm thinking about two or three actual days that have been special in this particular week. Of course, this first Sunday, which is National Submarine Day, and I want to talk to you about being underwater in our lives. I want to talk to you also about being unlettered because on Tuesday of this week, it's National Scrabble Day, or Scrabble Day, and it's actually an international day. And I want to talk to you a little bit about feeling like we are at loose ends in our lives. And then on Thursday of this coming week, it is National Rubber Eraser Day. And I want to talk to you a little bit about being unerased in life. The letter to the Colossians was written sometime during Paul's first imprisonment, either in Palestine before he was taken to Rome or shortly after he arrived in the city of Rome. It happened sometime then between the years 56 to 60. And so we can put that pretty clearly. Clearly, the book of Colossians is written by Paul with the help of a scribal secretary, or what was called in ancient times an amniosis. Likely Timothy was that man. And so it has that reworking that you would see by an editor of thoughts. The thoughts are Paul's, the direction, the purpose is Paul's, but clearly another hand has helped write the letter. And so we recognize that Timothy was probably part of this process. There's an interesting man mentioned in this letter, Epaphras. And Epaphras was a disciple of the Apostle Paul. He was from the city of Colossae, and he was probably the man who started the church. In fact, Paul indicates that in his letter, that Epaphras was the man who established the church at Colossae. Colossae is an interesting city. It had been a major city in Asia Minor, but by the time of the Apostle Paul, it had shrunk to just a small town. And so it was not really an important place. It was not like Ephesus or one of the other large cities in Asia Minor. It was now a small community. And so Paul writing there doesn't seem to make a lot of sense except for the connection with Epaphras. He did not start the church there. The church there was started by somebody else. And so Paul has very little personal connection with the people of Colossae. His connection to them is through Epaphras. It has a similarity to the book of Romans. The book of Romans also, Paul did not start the church at Rome, and so he does not have the intimate knowledge. He's not as concerned with the internal politics and the internal experience of that church. He is not concerned about his own position with that church. He is simply writing to them about things that he thinks are important for them to think about. And as a result of that, Colossians is much more of a doctrinal book. It deals a lot more with the concept of doctrine. And that's going to become important as we talk about that this morning. Very often as people, we feel like we are underwater in life. We feel like we're living in a submarine. A song that I'll be talking about a little bit in my messages today. And my message, our service begins in Riverdale at the Community Church at 8:30 this morning. And our service in Garrison at the Garrison Church of God begins at 10:30. So we invite you to come and be a part of either of these two services. But my message will be dealing with, or we'll be talking a little bit about a song that I heard when I was a kid. We all live in a yellow submarine. by the Beatles, and I'll be talking a little bit about that and a little bit about that experience. Another movie I'm going to be talking about happens to be a movie that was done by Cary Grant it was actually produced in 1959. It was called Operation Petticoat, and I'll be talking a little bit about that particular movie as well in my sermon today. I want to talk a little bit about submarines. Submarines have been around since 1620. The first one to be built was built in 1620 in England and was used in the Thames River. It was a very interesting submarine. It was propelled by oars. It wasn't very effective as a submarine, but it was the very first start at that process. And it was successful in the sense that it went down under the water and came up in a different spot, but it was not really very controllable underwater, or were you able to give very much direction to it, but it was a start. The first actual effective submarine was done in 1800, which I thought was kind of interesting, and that was actually produced in France, but by an American engineer. And that was kind of an interesting sidelight. The first effective submarine for military use was actually during the Civil War, and it was deployed by the Confederacy against the Union blockade in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. And that's a very interesting thing that I'll be talking a little bit about today as well. I'll also be talking about the first actual power-driven submarine, and that actually happened in 1867. So if you want to learn a little bit about that, I'll be sharing a little bit more about that in my message today. But very often we feel like we are underwater in life. We feel like we're being overwhelmed by the circumstances that we live with and the things that we deal with day in and day out. And that's part of life. One of the things that helps us understand our lives is that in 1 John, it talks about us not feeling like we are condemned, but that God loves us and cares about us and cares about our circumstances. And if our heart does give us a sense of condemnation, that God is greater than our hearts. And that becomes very important to us in our Christian walk, that we're not underwater really. Because Christ is Lord of our life, we are not underwater, even though at times it may feel like we are underwater. The other thing I want to talk to you about is being unlettered. In Isaiah, it says, one of the prophecies that Isaiah has says, God hands him a book and says, read, and the man says, I cannot read because I am unlettered. I thought about this concept of being unlettered. One of the interesting games that was developed in the 1930s was the game of Scrabble, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that particular game. It had a very unpretentious start. It seemed like it was impossible to get it off the ground, but when it did take off, it took off all of the sudden and became a major hit. In most English-speaking countries, 1 in 2 homes has a Scrabble game. And in the United States, 3 out of 5 homes have Scrabble games. So it has become a very, very important part of the English-speaking world. And I thought that was kind of interesting. The man who developed Scrabble, the concept of Scrabble, was actually an out-of-work architect. And I'll be talking a little bit more about his life, but he actually developed the game and worked very hard at making it happen and had an interest in language and how language worked. And so I'll be talking a little bit more about that. The idea is that it seems very often that we are pulled apart in many different directions. And we talk about being unlettered as being unable to make sense of things. And this man must have felt very much that way in 1933 when he was trying to make sense out of his world. But when we have Christ in our lives are not nonsensical. They make sense, they have purpose, they have meaning, and they have direction for us. The final thought I want to talk to you about is being unerased. We often feel like the world is erasing us, that we are disappearing, as it were, little chunks of ourselves. We feel like we're being rubbed out, as it were. It's interesting that the first rubber eraser was developed in 1770 by an Englishman who ran a stationery store. It was actually an accident. He picked up the wrong thing to erase a pencil mark with and discovered it worked better than what he had planned. And I'll be telling you a little bit more about that. But in our lives, it is true that we can feel like we're being erased. But if Christ is in our lives, we will never be erased. We have an eternal promise, an eternal hope in Him. And that is the great thing about being in Christ. We have an eternal promise. So we are not underwater. We are not unlettered or untethered in life. And we are not erased in life. We have a hope that goes beyond the moment. I'm glad you joined me today. God bless you. Hope to see you in church. Take care.